Good afternoon, BL family. Of course, I'm your host, Shabari Lamb, and we have yet a very special guest. We have Mrs. Kau. She is a renowned Liberian historian. She does great work on Focus on Liberia, and I felt it was important that we bring her on to discuss today's current topic, relations between African Americans and Indigenous Liberians. And I know that this is a topic that's constantly brought up in mainstream information about Liberia, and we're just going to dive into the relationship, correct misinformation, and see where we go forward from here. So, Mrs. Pombale, again, thank you for being on here, and we welcome you here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being on here. Where would you like us to start the conversation? There's just so much to discuss.
Yes. So, of course, I just want you to give information about yourself. Tell us the work that you do, why you do it, and then we'll
Um,
go deeper into the relations between African Americans and Indigenous Liberians.
sure. So I'm a lifelong student of African world history. I am Liberian. Both of my parents are from Nimba, which is in northern Liberia. And before there were borders, we're from along the St. John River, which is now partly in Guinea, partly in Liberia. And so the interesting thing about me, I guess, is that ancestry is very old in that area. And so on both sides of my family, I'm sort of a unicorn, meaning I don't have very much ethnic diversity in my background as far as different African ethnic groups. I'm mono from that area. And as far as anyone can remember, that's exactly who I am. So I want to get that out of the way. I was actually not born in Liberia. I was born and raised in Minnesota, which a lot of people don't know because I'm just so Liberian. But um, yeah, so I was born and raised in Minnesota. I have studied African world history since middle school. I got interested in politics and history, believe it or not, around 12, 13 years old. And it just has consumed my life and kind of directed what I've done. I'm a public policy professional. I did political science and public policy, and I have studied history under the tutorship of many historians like the great Mahmoud Al-Kati, who's a professor at Macalester College, sort of mentored me since I was a teenager and provided me guidance. So I study Liberian history from the perspective of African world history and not from the perspective of European history, but from the perspective of African world history. And so I think that might be a little different from what a lot of traditional Liberian historians have done, because my path and my journey to understanding Liberia has been from a very African-centered perspective. And even when I'm reading primary source documents written by Europeans, I do so in the context of me being an African, right? So I have to always put myself in the shoes of the subject of the Europeans, what they're writing, and what would my, great 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 grandfathers what would they have thought? How would they have seen these events? And that has helped me greatly to be able to understand things and, as I say, correctly, and see the world through my own eyes, through the eyes of our people. Um, so yeah, that's a little bit about me. Yeah, we can go from there.
It was just great you talking about your passion because that's something about me with history. I've been passionate about history since I was in the fourth grade, and just hearing that passion
Oh,
when you're younger, and then talking about we talked about earlier me being interested in Liberian history since high school. The passion is definitely there every time you're on Focus on Liberia, and the and the information that you dive every time that you're on there. So let's get to the relations between the African Americans, what people would today call quote unquote American Liberian, which we're about to get to first, and Indigenous Liberians. So, Ms. Fambule, can you tell us where does this current understanding of the relationship between African Americans and Indigenous Liberians come from? Because what I've heard most of the time is Americo-Liberian is a new term. It wasn't used historically through until recently, recent historians looking at it right now. Where does that all come from? And can you sort of elaborate why that particular narrative has gotten mainstream?
So I think, like with all human populations, the majority of the people living anywhere could care less about history. They only know what they kind of know, right? And they don't care to know anymore. And so it's not unique to Liberia. It's the same thing. You grew up in Minnesota. How many people know anything about Minnesota that grew up there? Nobody knows anything about Minnesota except the few people, like you and myself, that think this stuff is interesting. So the unfortunate part of not being interested in history and not having a society that intentionally teaches you history correctly is that it's where we get our identity from, right? History is how we define ourselves and understand where we fit into the rest of the world. So I preference all of that just to say that the concept of an Americo-Liberian is absurd. There are Liberians. And I would even argue that the concept of an indigenous Liberian is absurd because Liberia itself is a republic that was established. There is nothing indigenous about a republic. There is nothing American about our republic. The republic, the independence of Liberia, was acquired in 1847 when the United States was still actively practicing chattel slavery. And prior to 1847, the US flag flew over the heads of the repatriated Africans. And so when they wanted to get their independence and fought for it and decided to create not only a republic, but an asylum for freed Africans, a Black republic, when they decided to do this, this was a rebellion against the US flag. You had men like, you had men like Hillary Teague and Elijah Johnson that were tired of having this US flag flying over their heads. They created the republic so that they could be Liberian, period. They could be free men, not so they could be Americo-Liberian, not to hyphenate themselves, not so that they could have a schizophrenic identity, but so that they could be Liberians. And so personally, I reject the hyphenation. I don't think it is necessary. It is a Black republic, and all Africans, whether they had been born on the continent, on the Grain Coast, or if they had been born in the Niger Delta and rescued from slave ships, if they had been born in Barbados or the United States, when you become Liberian, you are Liberian.
That's very important that you bring that up because there's so much misconceptions about the relationship. We're going to talk about the very beginning. When people talk about Liberia and Liberia first comes to be, they think that these African American, these repatriates, seize the land. They're displacing the population. Can you please begin with when these African Americans, these repatriates, first arrived in Liberia, how they got there, what agreements were made, and we can really then go from there.
Yeah. So and a lot of this I do want to say is intentional propaganda, right? Especially once the Berlin Conference came into play, they did not want, Liberia stood as a testament to African excellence, to Black excellence. So they had to sabotage that because if this republic was successful, the whole premise for colonizing Africa no longer was valid. I want you to think about this. Liberia existed before the Berlin Conference, before the partitioning of Africa. And they wanted to justify partitioning Africa because they wanted to say that African people could not govern themselves. And they could not do that if Liberia was successful, if Haiti was successful. They could not do that, right? So some of the sabotage that you see of the history and the culture is intentional. When these people arrived, so there's a book that's available that was recently scanned into Google Books. It's called, so therefore it's free, it's public domain. It's called it's called the is it called the diary or the journal? I think it's called the journal of, anyway, I'll get back to that. I don't want to give misinformation, but there's a journal. There's a journal of, there's a journal that was written by one of the passengers on the Elizabeth that left New York in 1821. This vessel, the ship was created by, or not created, but hired by the U.S. government. And the American Colonization Society used this opportunity to also repatriate some missionaries and some others. So on the ship were people who were born in Africa and in the United States. That's another thing a lot of people don't know, that the very first ship that the American Colonization Society, which is the Elizabeth, there were some passengers, I think, that were repatriated or rescued captives from a slave ship that had been held in New York and were put on board the Elizabeth. So a lot of people don't know that. They think all of these people were born in the United States. They were not all born in the United States. Some of them were from a ship that had been seized because the transatlantic trade, though slavery was illegal, the transatlantic slave trade was not. So about half of the African or the Black passengers were these Africans who were born on the continent, and then roughly the other half were the liberated or already freed, African Americans, meaning a lot of them were mulatto, what we call in those days, what they called mulatto, mixed race people, and, and others. Missionaries were on board as well. So this group, there was a caste system. The other thing that people are not aware of is on the Elizabeth, the Black passengers were kept in the hull of the ship for most of the time. So if you're not familiar with how these ships were, the hull is the under part of the ship. And that, it gets hot there, it gets cold there, whatever it is, it's not a desire, it's not like a comfortable cabin. So there was already, and because of the times, it was 1821. And no matter how much people were abolitionists, they were racist. They didn't see themselves as equal. Just because they didn't think you should be in bondage doesn't mean they thought that you should live with them. Right?
That's what a lot of Northerners at the time thought. And that's what people don't.
So I don't want people to think that the ship had, everybody was hunky-dory and living, we're with the abolitionists. There was also an escort vessel, which was a military vessel, heavily armed. Two reasons the escort vessel was there. One, because it was, going to West Africa and there were pirate ships and all kinds of stuff going on. But the other reason nobody talks about was to prevent mutiny. So you have an escort vessel that is protecting the U.S. officials and the white ACS people from this Black crew, and also protecting them, from potential, mayhem that could occur in the Atlantic Ocean, which was, full of all kinds of, illegal traffickers and things like that. So there were two ships, Elizabeth, and then they had an escort vessel, which Eli Ayers and other military people were on. So these two ships sailed to what is now Sierra Leone, because that was a part of the coast where you had a history of repatriated Africans. They landed at Sherbro. At Sherbro Island, you had Paul Kofi and John Kizzle. And these were African Americans, or, Africans who had on their own repatriated to Africa and set up. In fact, there was a town called Kizzleton, where Kizzle basically created a settlement of free people. And, you had a lot of things going on the coast. And people often think that in 1821, 1822, that somehow this was some untouched, no man's land, and that, they were going and meeting, these savages that had never seen any white people before. And then couldn't be further from the truth.
Thank you, because that's one of the things that I made a video about, is people treating the indigenous people like they were primitive, like they didn't have contact with the outside world. When they were engaged in the slave trade, they met with Europeans, Can you really sort of elaborate that when they got to the coast? So
So
they
they got
left
to
New
the
York.
coast. They get to Sherbro right away. They're interacting with liberated, well, not liberated, but free people. They're sovereign Africans. I like the term sovereign Africans because it's important. There was no Berlin Conference yet. They're interacting with sovereign Africans. They're interacting with people who are self-determined. Nobody owns them. Nobody controls them. And so they were first negotiating for land there. And they started, some of these sovereign Africans didn't want to be bothered with the ACS, So at Sherbro, there was a lot of illness and a lot of the people perished. I do want to point out, when Elizabeth left New York, there is record that there was a 2-year-old child on board the Elizabeth that died from smallpox. I want you to remember that smallpox is extremely contagious. So the assumption is usually made that these guys got to Sherbro and were dying from malaria. It is possible some of them had smallpox as well. And it is also documented that some of the reasons people were kept in the hull of the ship was to prevent people from being infected. So you've got a slave ship that was rescued before, sometime earlier, and those people were being repatriated. Some of them were infected with smallpox, including the 2-year-old child who was, born in America, but her mother, was on the slave ship that was rescued, if that makes sense. So they were kept in New York for a couple of years. She had a child. The child was roughly 2 years old when they were being sent back to Africa, and that child died of smallpox. And we're still doing a little bit of research. I'm trying to figure out if there were some symptoms that would have went along, but a lot of these people at Sherbro perished. And if you're fighting something like smallpox and you get malaria, you'll probably die, right? Because you've got multiple illnesses going on. So when the vessel arrived at Sherbro, there was a lot of illness. It was tragic. The members of the ACS also died. So it wasn't just the Africans. And so I do suspect that some of the sickness that was there was smallpox. But that aside, they needed to find a different place. Part of the tragedy was that the place that was found at Sherbro was a swampy area, and it wasn't a healthy environment. So they needed to find better land that was drier and that would be more conducive to building a town. And so Dr. Ayers and Captain Stockton went down the coast looking for land, got to Cape Mount. King Massaquoi wanted nothing to do with them. They kept going. They got to finally Providence Island, where they met what they called in those days a mulatto, an African that was native who was go ahead.
Yeah. Please talk about that, because people treat the indigenous population as if there weren't mixed race people there, that they didn't have that we brought the Western mindset. Can you please talk about that, the naming and the leaders and that whole Western mindset?
Absolutely. So there were so even in Sierra Leone, there were a lot of before, you've got the Tuckers, you've got so I want everyone to know that Liberia and Sierra Leone on that coast is pretty much to say it's a continual place, right? So you've got British people for centuries interacting. The Calkers, the Tuckers, various people were descendants of British traders, probably slave traders, trading other goods. And so they were already speaking English, somewhat Christian, right? Had a little bit of that, influence mixed with their traditional culture. But there was a long history. I mean, the Plantain Islands of people who were mixed race and intercultural people. Like anywhere, if you have a trading area or a port city, you're going to have interactions with different people. So there were also Europeans settled all along the coast. Not only were there mixed race people, because people interact, right? There were also Europeans in Cape Mount. There's records of Europeans that were living at Cape Mount before, 1822. So there was history of them giving people places to settle along that coast. So it wasn't the first time that people had said, okay, yeah, you guys can settle in this area over here, because it had been done. So when they arrived, they were greeted. They were greeted at Providence Island. And there was a mix. I hate the word mulatto, but that's the language that was
Yeah,
used.
that's the word that was used. We don't use like mulatto, quadroon, or
Yeah, we don't
Afros
use it, and
anymore.
I
But
don't
in the
even like
context,
using mixed race. Like, what do you mix with, dog and cat? Like, you're a human being. So I just prefer. The reason I'm using it is just for historical context.
yeah,
These people had this
it's
man had a European, a British father, and a Day. Day is the ethnic group. He had a Day mother. So he spoke the Day language, um, and he greeted them. And the first thing he did was he sold them Providence Island, and then arranged for even more land. Called together a bunch of headmen, leaders, and probably generals, and whatever else, and tried to arrange a sale of a good portion of Cape Meserado that was unoccupied. That initial sale was mostly of unoccupied swampy areas where there were no existing villages. I think that's important for people to understand too. This was not the purchase of the entire Republic of Liberia. This was a place for them to set up a community. And what was negotiated for them was an area that was not inhabited. That being said, there were other acquisitions of other territories and other properties over time. But that initial acquisition was not between the repatriated Africans and the sovereign Africans on the ground. It was between agents of the American Colonization Society and sovereign Africans. If you look at the document that was signed, the signatories to that document are Africans and white men. So the initial purchase, and this is important, and this gets into why 1847 was necessary. They were still, in a way, treating the repatriated Africans as their subordinates.
mm,
They were
this
not brought along to negotiate for their own property, for their own place to stay. They were still expected to follow the lead of these white men, which is
mhm.
why this eventually leads to why Liberia, which I don't consider Liberia to have come into existence until 1847, but this is what created the need. This is why Liberia became necessary.
Mm-hmm.
It
This is
was,
it's so great that you brought that up because one of our viewers commented there were a lot of tensions between I don't like the word settlers and ACS agents initially, and you bringing
yes,
up the thing. Can you sort of go into
yes.
that now
So
that we're
of
into that?
course, even at Sherbrooke, when after they negotiated for this land, and so the Elizabeth had gone back to the States, they negotiated for this land. They sent two smaller vessels to bring people. Some of them were like, "We're not going with y'all. We're not going anywhere with y'all. We've been here hanging out with Kizzle, and we're gonna stay here with Kizzle because Kizzle's a brother like us, and we don't have to deal with y'all. We're not going." So there was a good percentage of that initial group that survived the illness that said they're not going on to Cape Meserado. It wasn't because they didn't want to go and set up their own place. They did not want to be under the subjugation of the American Colonization Society. I want you guys to think about this. Kizzleton, all these places were completely liberated. There was no white governor for them to be answerable to. That was true freedom and self-determination. And so not everyone wanted to go on to Cape Meserado. So they went to Cape Meserado with about half of the people that they initially intended to. So half had already, some had perished and some refused to continue on. And the ones who remained at Sherbrooke are now, their descendants are now Sierra Leoneans. Those who went on to Cape Meserado, there was more sickness and more death, and there was war. So a lot of them perished as well. And over time, more ships would come, and they were also the British abolitionists worked out something with the ACS because the ACS realized, oh, we get money every time we welcome a rescued slave ship full of captives. So they're taking them to Freetown. The British government's giving all those pounds to the people in Freetown. Hey, we're ACS, we'll take them too. That was a way for them, these white men, to also generate revenue. And who did they task with the responsibility of incorporating and acculturating these newly rescued Africans that were being taken out of, the Niger Delta area and all these places? The very same people that they were not allowing to truly govern themselves. So you have two things going on. You've got ACS, you've got the white men, white supremacy, the whole idea. Yes, you guys are not in chains anymore, but you don't know better. Follow us, we'll teach you what to do. And your brethren are savages, they need to become Christian. And so you've got the Black missionaries, Lot Carey, everyone going in and trying to Christianize people. So there was a lot of conflict. The other thing people don't like to talk about is that some of the Africans were anti-abolitionists. They did not want to stop.
Please talk about that, because C. Patrick Burroughs, which you and I know, brought up the Liberian Purchase Agreement. And I told the viewers here that when they got there, they had to listen to pro-slavery and anti-slavery arguments. Can you sort of explain to the viewers the interest that these leaders and nations that we today consider Liberia had in the slave trade?
So I always want us to put ourselves, Jabari, we have to always put ourselves in history. So even today, you have people will be talking about, some movement, Black Lives Matter, or whatever, Black Panther Party, talk about anything. There's always going to be those dudes that's like, what y'all crazy? What y'all talking about? Master always been good to us. So there's never a single narrative coming out of the Black community, any Black community. So don't ever look at any group of Black people and think that we all think the same. There's always those dudes in our midst that think the way things are is working great for him. Massa is working great for us, right? So you've got this powerful group of armed indigenous, I don't like the word indigenous, these armed sovereign Africans, right? You've got this group of armed, they're heavily armed because they're in cahoots with the Europeans. And they're benefiting. They're benefiting from this conquest of the Europeans, and they're supplying human chattel to these Europeans. You've got another group of Africans who are also abolitionists, sovereign Africans who are opposed to the slave trade. They are less powerful. They have less military power because nobody's supplying them with ammunition and guns. Because if you give them guns, they'll stop the slave trade. So you've got these sovereign Africans, like King Peter, who I'll get into. I believe he also is a descendant of some intermarriage and stuff. But you've got King Peter, who his name was Peter. Nobody named him Peter. His father's name was King Peter. His grandfather's name was King Peter. You go back to the 1500s and you read they say, oh, King Peter, Lord of Maserado. They've always called the king of Maserado King Peter. I don't know why, but there's all kinds of theories about that. Long story short, King Peter, these people signed this agreement when the slave dealers realized, they're like, hey, these guys want to stop the slave trade. The British are picking up ships and they're going to, increase the presence of the abolitionists on the coast. We've got to get rid of the settlement. So they start to fight the Liberian settlement. It wasn't because the land was gotten by force. It was because somebody realized, hey, these people didn't just come to live here. They're going to set up shop. They're going to stop our slave trade. They're going to join these African abolitionists. They're going to give them arms, and they're going to destroy our way of life. So it became a conflict between abolitionists and anti-abolitionists, or the people who are pro slave trade. And so that's really what the conflict, that's what the record demonstrates. Both the historic written record of not only the ACS, but also European slave traders who hated the presence of the settlement at Cape Mesurado because it would thwart their efforts.
And speaking of that, you have an example in 1822. It's known as what people refer to as the day settler war, what they say quote unquote. But it was when you had Cuban sailors who were supportive of the slave trade and their day allies basically attacking the African American repatriates and their day allies. So
Exactly.
and then it's not just that, you have the Bassa War that happens. Then you have the Port
Sure.
Croissant
What
Massacre.
happened at Trade Town? You've got it. I mean, it was repeated and it happened in waves throughout Liberian history, where you've got groups of people working in the interest of of European imperialists against their own interests. It happened repeatedly during Liberian history.
Mm-hmm.
Even after slavery, even with the Grable Wars on that occurred later on. It
The
was once
Gola
again
Mandingo War.
the French, this is after now, the Berlin Conference. The French have the tentacles, into the Ivory Coast. They want to push their influence westward. And you've got the British on the other side trying to push their influence eastward, and the French in the north trying to push their influence towards the south. And you've got their allies among the Africans who are used against the Liberian state. And you have people like my great-great-grandfather who fought in defense of the Liberian state.
Mm.
You
And so
know,
that and that goes into this whole indigenous Liberians were excluded and they were brutally oppressed by these Americos as they claim. Can you go into that? If they were what they claim to be so oppressed, why would they have sided with the Liberian government when they had time, ample opportunities to go with the British, to go with the French, to go with the Germans, to go to even some other African kingdoms who were pro-slavery, pro-imperialist? Explain the role that
so
indigenous Liberians had.
I like discussing things chronologically. So let's close the chapter on the first settlement. Now we've moved
Okay.
fast forward. The state has been established. We've got the great founder of the republic, the real true father of Liberia,
Hillary
Hillary
C.
T. And he has already, the first citizen. They've declared not only their sovereignty, but they have declared sovereignty for all Africans who touch their soil. I want you to understand how powerful this is. There are two ways, I should say, that you get incorporated into a country. It's either by will or by force. You become a citizen of a country either by will or by force. And under will, we can talk about birth and all that kind of stuff. But a country that's new, what we have to realize, and I'm going to speak specifically of my ancestors because everyone on the coast is not the same. I am from Nimba. I am from northern Liberia. My ancestors had a different experience than somebody from Bassa Cove would have had, or someone from Cape Mesurado would have had. I want you to remember that. Talking about people as if they're all the same confuses history. So we had strong central authorities. We had our own country. We had our own rulers, our own laws, our own government. So my ancestors were not trying to go and be part of these low, funny looking Africans that settled on the coast wearing top hats and walking around with canes. They didn't want to be bothered with that. You had people along the St. Paul River who were Muslims. They weren't trying to go to Lot Carey School or send their children there. So some of this integration and assimilation and becoming part of the state was either born of necessity, like, King Peter's clan had to join the state for protection from his enemies. You've got a lot of groups that joined the settlement because they were rescued from slave ships, or when Trade Town was destroyed, all those captives that came from where my people are from that were being sold into slavery joined the Republic very early on. In fact, before there was a Republic, joined the settlement very early on and were among the first citizens of Liberia. So people became integration was a trickling thing, and it was something that occurred for different reasons at different points in time. When the Republic was established, this is very important. They did not do and they did not replicate what America did to Indigenous people, because Lord Carey, Elijah Johnson, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, they didn't have the will or the power to subjugate 1 million people belonging to probably about 8 or 9 different nations. And then you have other ethnic groups that didn't belong to nations, or we call, stateless bands of people like the Grebo and other groups who lived differently. But the people in the North, we're talking about at least 8 or 9 different actual nations with rulers that had to pay taxes to their kings, right? They didn't have, and they had militaries. They didn't have the power to subjugate King Mamalu from Bopu and people like that, or King Masakwe in Cape Mount. They didn't have the power to subdue these people. So the indigenous people that joined the settlement, they did so through the mission schools. They did so because either their villages had been burned down and they needed a place to seek refuge. It was never a forced situation. And I need to also emphasize that they always say, oh, they didn't allow us to be part. There's no evidence that anyone was ever denied citizenship. What I know, as recently as my mother's generation, and definitely my grandmother's generation, they didn't want to be bothered with this country that they call Liberia. They had their own nations, their own laws. So when they started to value education and they started to change and they realized Africa around them was changing, the school, Ganta Methodist, was built near my home in 1944. My parents were able to go to school and get an education, become westernized, become Christians, right? We weren't Christians before that. So we're very new in this westernization thing, we from the North. So Christianity came to us in the 1940s. I want you to think about this. And so if you talk about Bassa people on the coast, Christianity came to them much earlier. So many of the early Liberians were the coastal people, but we in the North, you're talking about my grandparents' generation were the first to be Christianized and things like that. So the process was not, uniform. The frontier forces, which was the predecessor to the current military, incorporated a lot of young warriors from the northern region of Liberia. And that was a very smart thing. Those are the people that helped to protect our borders from French incursion. My direct ancestor is one of those as well. I'm sorry, I'm rambling.
Oh, you're good. No, you're good.
Okay.
Because I'm just addressing a comment because some of them are asking,
Mm-hmm.
can you sort of name the groups of people who allied with the repatriates? Like what specific groups in particular allied with them, or were they just, it depended on circumstances?
Yeah. So Jabari, you said something really important. Right at the beginning, the slave traders had their allies and the settlement had their allies. That statement you made is significant because there is no group thinking process going on with anybody. You understand? The same way you can sit in Decatur here in Georgia and people on the same block that went to the same schools and the same churches can have completely different opinions about something, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing. So I'll give an example. The Bandi people in northern Liberia. There are some Bandi people in Sierra Leone. There's some Bandi people in Guinea. There's some Bandi people in Liberia. Bandi people fought for the French. Bandi people fought for the British. Bandi people fought for Liberia. Mono people, I'm Mono. There were Mono people who fought against Samori Toure for the French. And there were Mono people who fought for Samori Toure.
Mm-hmm. And Samori Toure was the same.
Yeah,
and
the
Samori
Mono
Toure was the
people,
same man
yeah.
who invaded Liberia. Right.
So
Yeah, you're right.
The Mano people who fought for Samori Touré, some of them are Muslim today. I have Muslim cousins in Guinea, right? Distant cousins in Guinea who are Muslim. They fought with Samori Touré. They're Muslim people. You know, the ones. So it's not like being in an ethnic group and speaking a language makes, at that time, with the type of dynamics that were going on in history, it oversimplifies things to put an ethnic group into a box and say these people did this. And to address your issue of indigenous Liberians being brutalized by settlers, you know, using the terminology that is common to people, of course that happened. Of course that happened. And the elitism, of course it happened. And so did, you know, the idea of, hey, we've got to come together and unite. So did, you know, the opposite of that. So you've got a situation where you've got African people who were born in the United States, and at this point they're Christians. They think that the African cultures that they're interacting with are savage, are demonic. They think these guys are pagans, godless people, and you need to change your ways, because that's what Christianity, that's what religion does. Islam did it too. Muslims thought that, you know, the traditional African religion was demonic. Same thing with Christians. That's what these adopted religious cultures do to us. They turn us against one another, and it creates an air of us versus them. So it wasn't unique to repatriated Africans, because even before they came, the Muslims had the same attitude towards the people who were practicing traditional African ways of life. So it isn't something that's strange. Did all Muslims do this? No. Did all Christians do this? No. Was Lot Carey a religious extremist? Absolutely. But he thought he was right. He wanted to Christianize everyone so they could go, you know, part with from their devil worshiping and be saved.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately for him, he died fighting people who didn't want to be saved. You know, so so it is what it is. I think if anything from this lecture I'd like to share that I've learned is that there is no single narrative that can pinpoint or box any particular group. Did you have disparity in culture, and did you have you know, at some point, you know, even the so-called indigenous Liberians, again, I don't like the term, but just for people to understand who I'm talking about, when they became Christian, they also looked down on their own relatives in the villages and refused to go back and live there. And I'm staying in Monrovia. In fact, I'm going to change my name to Cox. Mr. Cox sponsored me to school. I'm no longer going to be Yakwa Willow. I'm going to be Cox. And I'll be damned if I send my children, you know, to go visit those savages in the village that I was born in. It is what happens when people start to change. You know, it is unfortunate, but that's what happens. And so I think it's also wrong for us to pretend that people who were not westernized were looked down upon. Of course they were looked down upon. And they were taught to look down upon their own culture through the inland church, through the, you know, African Methodist, even the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was probably the most progressive, most Pan-African church ever. But even that church, with all of its progress, thought that the only way to salvation was for you to part with your traditional African beliefs and become Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I just want to make note, that's not
mm-hmm.
an ideology that was strictly to Liberia. That was what Africans thought in general, whether or not they were in South Africa, they were in the Congo.
Exactly.
Any Africans who were Christian at that time believed that anything to do with your traditional religion was considered demonic. And Europeans did the same thing with their religions. When Christianity was first spreading through Europe, when we think of European history, we think that, oh, they just were naturally Christian. No, they worshiped Norse mythology, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and then the Christians came through. Some of them did voluntarily, and then others burned down pagan icons, They waged war, the Crusades, Spanish Inquisition. So it's not just specifically
Yeah,
us. So that's why I push back on that whole Western mindset and we did this stuff when
right.
y'all don't give that same energy. Y'all don't get
It
that
was
same
exactly,
energy.
yeah. It's exactly how what we consider to be Europe was conquered. You know, when the Romans conquered the barbarians in the north, nobody was reading and writing, right? They were all illiterate pagans. And in fact, there were so many illiterate pagans that Rome had to compromise with these savages, right? And incorporate their savage ways into the church, their pagan traditions into the church in order to get them to come on board and become Catholic. So what was some of the things, you know, we have Christmas trees, we incorporate Yule into things we do today. That's the you know, that's just the way Abrahamian religions work. They're imperialistic, you know, and that's just what they do. Um, okay, I'm seeing many
Yes,
African
so
groups voluntarily operated, we incorporated. Yes. So it was, no one became Liberian by force. I have not seen where someone held a gun to someone's head and said, bow down to this flag. I am Liberian today because that was a choice. And I promise you, that map of Liberia, the part that they call Nimba that goes up into Guinea, if my ancestors wanted to be French, I would be speaking French. Because the French wanted that land. It was not a gift. It was a combination of two things. It was a combination of the Liberian state having intelligent legal minds that thought and wrote and articulated their position and their demand for their sovereignty, and appealed to not the conscience of Europeans, but to their own laws to protect their sovereignty, and the military intervention of African Americans who were fighting for the US military on behalf of Liberia, and the thousands of indigenous warriors who were trained to defend our boundaries. So we exist as a country, as Liberians, by choice.
mm-hmm.
There has been no time in the entire history from the settlement to 1980 where there could not have the so-called indigenous did not have the power to crush the republic. They have always had the power to crush the republic, and more so back then than they did in 1980. So if you see that we are existing within that territory, it was because that's what we wanted. Were there people who should Liberia be much bigger than it is? Absolutely. But there were people who colluded with Europeans to the detriment of the descendants.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I always like to tell people that complain about Liberia, I'm like, yes, we're underdeveloped, we have been sabotaged, there's a lot of things wrong, but I look at my cousins in Guinea and I look at myself in Liberia. They are landless, I am not.
Mm-hmm.
There's huge French-owned plantations. As much as Sekou Touré tried, they the product of colonialism is so strong that most African people are landless. Liberia is the only country on the planet where 100% of its territory is owned by Black people.
Mm-hmm.
Liberia is the only country on planet Earth. Haiti has white landowners, white citizens. Jamaica, and there's nowhere else on the planet Earth, nowhere else in Africa, where 100% of the land is owned by African people. It is the only place. And it's because we were established as an asylum for free Africans. We have protectionist laws that do not allow citizenship for anyone other than Africans, and only citizens can own land. Genius. This is before the Berlin Conference. It's like they saw it coming. They
Mm-hmm.
made it illegal for indigenous Liberians who are not even fully incorporated into the republic to sell their land, because they didn't want people coming in and buying up real estate from indigenous kings in the north.
Mm-hmm.
So they put in the constitution that within that territory, you cannot buy land from indigenous people. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of Liberians say, oh, you see, they didn't want us to sell land. No, they didn't. And that's good. That's why I have a farm in Liberia today.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Let's
That's why
and,
I had something to be passed down to me today.
and let's add under Daniel Basher Warner, he had the Port of Entry Act, which specifically said there were certain areas they could do business for that reason of trying to prevent them from getting into the interior. So
Exactly.
what you're saying it knits perfectly. And speaking of your cousins in Guinea, talk about the thing that people don't forget about, because people think that these these repatriates were just doing the bidding of Western nations when they were stuck in a bad situation where they had lost their territory. You know, the Galenas territory, the Kabbalah River. You know, places in
Man,
Guinea. Can you sort of explain to them how these repatriates had to navigate in that situation, and not they were trying to see how they could, jockey for Western position?
so I want you guys to remember that, always look at history from a global perspective, African history from a global perspective. So you had in the 19th century, that was a period of excellence for African people. That was before these guys figured out that they needed to really crush us. And because once we were left alone, we started to thrive. I want you to think about Black Wall Street. I want you to think about all of the Black people in the United States that were elected, duly elected to office. I want you to think about the progress we made during segregation. And I want you to think about Liberia in those terms. I want you to understand that there was a parallel period of African excellence in the United States and Liberia, where you had these great African thinkers, Edward Wilmot Blythe and all of these people coming up at the same time. It was a period where the agents of white imperial, European, Western imperialism realized if you leave them alone, they will thrive. And they will not only thrive, they will outshine. You get me? So what did they do? We're going to suppress. We're going to destroy Black Wall Street. We're going to destroy Liberia. We're going to take their land in America. We're going to create a situation and force them into urban centers of poverty. We're going to create a situation in Liberia. We're going to land grab. We're going to pit the one group against another. We're going to start propaganda and strife. We're going to erase the history of cooperation and replace it with a false narrative, a false and simplistic narrative that, oh, the people came and conquered you. We're going to teach the Liberians that what happened, what we did, and I'm talking from the perspective of the Europeans, what was done in America is what was done to your people. And
Or
that is
apartheid
what they
South
did.
Africa, which just makes me go, my head explode whenever I
So
hear
so
somebody.
they when they talk, oh, it was apartheid, I'm like, you don't know what apartheid is.
They don't
We
know what
don't know what the
definitions is.
hell apartheid is.
They don't know what colonialism is. They don't know
We
what
don't
repatriation.
know what the hell apartheid is. There is not, look, I speak of myself because the people on the coast and, the Crew people, the Bravo people, the Bassa people, they have been, they have been part of Liberia longer than my ancestors have. When I say part of Liberia, we existed in the territory, but we were pretty much sovereign. We're doing our own thing. We're trading with Liberia, but we weren't really subject to their laws, right? Till honestly, the 1920s to 40s is really when it started picking up. And so for the first 100 years Liberia existed from the settlement, my ancestors were going about their business, being who they were, until that
Mm.
partitioning of Africa came, and then we became Liberian by necessity. Because when the Berlin Conference happened, we could no longer just continue to exist. Now we're running into a situation where they're saying, hey, these Liberians don't have control over those savages in the north. You've
Mm-hmm.
got the situation where Samori Toure was resisting French. And then the people within the Liberian territory that joined Samori were fighting the French. That was a problem. So they wanted to take that territory. You're not controlling these people. They're joining Samori Toure to fight us, as if Samori Toure didn't have a right to fight.
Mm-hmm. And some of his people went to Liberia, despite some more, like you said, a history being multifaceted. Some of his people went into Liberia and burned villages and all that, and then some of his people ended up marrying and became, part of the Muslim communities in Liberia today.
So Samori Toure, they practice slavery, right? Because they have that Asiatic cultural influence where they practice literally chattel slavery, from their influence from the religion and the culture that they had for centuries. And so Samori was also, in a lot of ways, a jihadist. This was a holy war for him. He
Yes.
believed that people, it was slash and burn. You had to convert to Islam. Islam was the only way we're going to liberate ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we
Which
had the
is,
jihadi threat. We had the jihadi threat when they were going in, when they were losing the war to the French, and they went
yeah,
in and was burning five villages. They were burning, like I said, taking people hostage. One time they like did a beheading and told her to walk like the whole village to where she lived. So of course not to, but it's just to demonstrate what we were up against. We
yeah.
were not going up against like, oh, they were just jiving for Western interests. This was, you got two imperialist powers. You have a jihadist coming in, burning your whole communities. What were these people supposed to do? Were they supposed to sit idly by and just let them come in and take over, or were they supposed to fight back?
That was it. So it was craziness going on. There was a time when Samori actually appealed to the Liberian government for help.
Mm.
So it's not that he was necessarily fighting Liberia. And I think that might be a little bit of what I've seen from the evidence is more of a situation where he try to put yourself in the shoes of a person who has been sovereign. His mother, was killed and sold into slavery. I'm sorry, sold into slavery and killed. Excuse me, killed and then sold into slavery. It happened the other way around. His own mother, he lost his he lost his own mother, because of a slave raid. Samori did. So Samori Toure wasn't an enemy of the Liberian state. What he wanted the Liberian government to do was to join him in his fight against the French. And that is what the Liberian government did not do. If the Liberian government had openly joined Samori Toure to fight the French, Liberia would have been crushed and America would have not done anything to help them at all. Because this was now, you're talking about a time period when France was much more powerful than the United States, and so was Britain. These countries were more powerful than the United States at this point. This is the late 1800s. So they didn't have the military might to fight these people. So that's important to know. Samori was a very barbaric fighter. So history's complicated. I'm not saying that he was this good guy.
Yeah, he was. I wouldn't say he was a good guy in
Yeah,
my
I'm
personal
not
opinion.
saying he was this good guy, but his indignation against the French was righteous.
Mm-hmm.
His indignation, his wanting self-determination is the right of every human being. And brutality in war historically is the way you advance your cause. That's how our ancestors, all of us are descendants of people who at some point in time in history were brutal as hell, and that's why we exist. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. None of us exist by accident. So human history is marked by conquest and subjugation. That being said, I'm not justifying what he did. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
explaining it from his perspective and the perspective of those who worked with him. So his mindset was, if everyone speaks Madingo and everyone practices Islam, we'll be united. Is that something kind of like Pan-Africanism? Possibly. But it was by force. And
Mm-hmm.
so you had other people that were like, man, what this guy wants us to speak Madingo, man, let's they fought him.
It's more pan-Islamic than it is pan-African in a way.
It's pan-Islamic, it's pan-Mandingo. You know, Mandingo. There's the number of Mandingo people that exist is not an accident. It's an imperialistic culture as well. And many of the people who are Mandingo today, their ancestors were not Mandingo. They were forced to speak the language, and they were forced to adopt Islam by Samori Touré's forces. A lot of people who are Mandingo today don't know that. They didn't actually come from Kankan. They didn't actually come from Kankan region in northern Guinea. Some of those people are from right where they are. It was just that, you know, that's the nature. And ethnicity, culture, religion, this is fluid. This is not something that's necessarily in your blood. This is something that is learned behavior. And if you live among people, you become like them. And so the expanse of Islam, the expanse of the Mandingo culture, it's not through childbirth. It's through conquest. It's through war and conquest. Even the same thing with the Hausa, the same thing with the Fulani, the same thing with these massive ethnic groups like the Yoruba. Those people are not great in numbers because they have lots of babies. They're great in numbers because they conquer weaker people and incorporate them, absorb them. That's something we need to realize too as we study West African history, that when you're looking at these massive transnational ethnic groups, they're actually a conglomeration of conquerors and the conquered.
That is so important. And I want we're about to wind down. I really want to harp down these 2 points. The first point is he said, Woe Baby said, the oppressive narrative comes from the 1800s by whites and Black Americans who were against repatriation. People like William Lloyd Garrison, William Nesbitt, as well as Frederick Douglass, who portrayed Africans as savages, basically saying we're like Anglo civilization. So can you sort of go into that, and then I'll get into my final question, and then
yeah, that's really important. It is definitely a Western narrative. Frederick Douglass was very much a product of his time period. He was brilliant, but he was wrong on a lot of things. And that is, you know, something that John Henry Clark always used to emphasize, is that sometimes you have two opposing correct positions throughout history. And he always wanted us to look at, I guess, my understanding of the way to look at people like W.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass and Delaney and Marcus Garvey is to look at what good they contributed. And the fact that everyone is not some 1 or 2 dimensional being, but a 4-dimensional being, right? So you can have a warped world view like Bishop Desmond Tutu and still be a brilliant messenger. So we don't want to throw away the Frederick Douglasses and people like this because of they were products of their environment and their time period. We want to pick from them the wisdom that they left behind, and we can, you know, kind of realize that it was tainted with their worldview was tainted by the circumstances they were raised in.
Yeah, the ideological framework. Whenever I did a video just yesterday or on Friday where I talk about when people were talking about how Liberia treated Garvey. You have to understand the time period, of course, the French and the British, but also Garvey's ideological framework. You can't just say he would have came in and it would have been roses and all stuff. You have to understand their ideological framework so that you can understand how they responded, as well as the government's ideological framework. So I'm glad the way that you bring that up. And
Charles D.B. King too. I mean, he was a horrible.
He was. Fraudulent
he was one of the worst. He was one of the worst people from that time period, and his presidency marked the end of Liberian free thinkers. To me,
Charles D.B. King. After it was once Charles D.B. King, then you have Edward Barclay and William V.S. Tubman with his 27 years.
Yeah,
he's a give or take.
You bring me back to talk about Tubman.
Yeah, we can
Tubman
talk.
was a mixed bag, just like Frederick Douglass.
Yeah,
just like the
that's what I'm about
Bois,
to say. I was gonna say
mixed bag.
yeah, he was
But
a mixed bag. I
D.B.
agree.
King, I can't find a single redeeming quality about Charles D.B. King.
I
He
know.
was
I can't
he was
stand Charles D.B. King.
I mean, he should have worn tap shoes through his entire life. It should have been just
Oh
tap
yeah,
dancing.
he was
He
doing the
was, I
two-step
mean, I
shuffle,
just
stepping
see
and
him with the
dancing.
cane and the tap shoes. I mean, he didn't have a spinal cord at all. At least Tubman had a spine. You
Yeah.
know, this guy he had no spine. He was an absolute coward. And I mean, and maybe we needed a coward. Maybe if we didn't have a coward, that we're gonna, completely destroy Liberia. I don't know. But
Mhm.
he was the epitome of cowardice. And
Mhm.
yeah, and so that's what I don't like about him.
All right, and
Tubman
yeah,
go
and
ahead.
I don't want to keep you going because I know that you're big. There's just so much. I'm gonna bring you back on because there's just so much
Okay.
information we have to dive in. But my last question would be: how do you think African Americans should look at Liberia? Why they should be proud of it, and what responsibility do you think African Americans have to Liberia? Should they be able to become automatic citizens again?
Absolutely.
Uh, should What is your take on that?
African Americans are still automatic citizens. That's still in the Constitution. So the thing is, people say, "Oh, dual citizenship," blah blah blah. So you can. I mean, I'm a dual citizen. I was born in Minnesota, and not just because my parents are Liberian, but we've got Reverend Umoja. We've got a lot of African Americans who have continuously gone to Liberia and live as Liberians. It's not something new. It never stopped. It never ended. Even after 1980, people continue to go. And then there's a lot of intermarriage between people born in Liberia and people born here and whatnot. But you still have the Negro clause on the books. It's still in the Constitution. So you can be born in Jamaica, you can be born in Nigeria, you can be born in Kenya, you can be born in New York, you can be born anywhere. And as long as you have African ancestry, you are a Liberian. And that is not me saying it, that's our Constitution. So there is the only process for you to hold a Liberian passport, and this has never changed, is for you to go and apply for one. And they're going to make you go through some ceremony where you renounce your U.S. citizenship in your mouth. But it's not anything that you can really renounce. You can't really renounce your U.S. citizenship. It's just a formality where you're saying you're giving your loyalty and your allegiance to the Black Republic, and that's it. It's that simple. And that is who we still are. And people don't understand that. They keep saying, "Oh, we need dual citizenship." I'm like, shut up! Don't draw attention to this. Stop. Sorry, we're already dual citizens. It's just a formality. You just say it, and that's it. Nobody cares. There's a lot of people who were born in the Caribbean and in North America that live in Liberia. It didn't have to be the government saying we declare this. That is why Liberia exists, and it is your birthright as an African American. That is your piece of the continent that was carved aside for you, to have a place to look at and call your own.
Hmm. And is it something that African Americans should be proud of? Because, like I said, the propaganda has been out there, but you personally, is this something that we should be proud of? I mean, personally, me,
Yes,
I'm proud of it, but I want to hear from you.
Liberia is the Black Wall Street that won't die. That won't die. I mean, we've got so many problems. You know, it reminds me of that Color Purple, movie when Whoopi Goldberg's character said, we still here or something. She's been through all this hell, but she's still here. That's Liberia. The fact that we still exist is a freaking miracle. We survived all kinds of intentional sabotage from the Berlin Conference to the Cold War. 1980 was a result of Cold War propaganda, and we're still here. We've got George Weah as president, and everybody's mocking us, but guess what? We're still here. We still exist in your face. We didn't die. And so the fact that we exist should give us hope. It should give us something to be proud of and something to work for. Have we manifested the vision and the dreams of Hillary T. and Elijah Johnson? The answer is no.
But
Should we manifest the vision of Hillary Teague and Elijah Johnson? The answer is absolutely yes. Who should do it? All of us. All of us. That is our responsibility. Liberia will be redeemed and it will manifest the intended destiny of our ancestors if we all pull together and do it. And that means African Americans. That means people born in Liberia. That means whoever sees themselves connected to that soil.
Thank you so much. And one final thing, it was from a viewer. They said, so technically we can keep, he's talking about that situation with the citizenship. So we can technically, yeah. So Flame Tupo, yes. To answer your question, yes. All right.
Yeah, you're technically, so there's a technicality, right? It says that we don't recognize dual citizenship, but nobody cares. It's completely ignored because the rule that's against dual citizenship contradicts the Constitution. The Constitution takes precedence. So the Supreme Court ruled that nobody can have, their Liberian citizenship denied. So by right, you will still be asked to go through this rant about renouncing your citizenship of birth, but it's not real.
Yeah. I wanted to make sure because that was one of another viewer. They said, can Liberian citizenship afforded to African Americans be obtained at the Liberian Embassy in DC, New York, in a ceremony? Like she said, it should be clarified. So you're the expert, so I'm gonna let you.
Yeah, I think the Supreme Court just recently ruled that basically the Constitution takes precedent over whatever laws. You can't create laws that contradict the Constitution, basically.
Okay, to answer your question, Baruti, well, it depends. I'm gonna say it depends. I'm not gonna be definitive yes or no. I'm just gonna say.
And in practice, no one has ever been denied Liberian citizenship. In practice. So there's no history of any African American that has ever been told you can't be a Liberian citizen. There's no record of that. Or Liberian parents who have their children abroad who go back who have said, oh, you're not a Liberian. I'm a prime example.
Thank you so much. You've been giving us so much words of wisdom. The people in the chat are just excited for the energy that you gave them.
Oh, thank you.
Said, it was once said the love of liberty brought us here. Now the love of liberty unites us. And one of my great friends, Spirit Lifter, shout out to you. She says, I am too being proud of Liberia. Hearing her words did something for my soul. The fact that we are automatic citizens. So you did a great job. We're definitely going to have you on. Make sure you can get them at any embassy. Like, okay, as long as it's the embassy, don't want to get too in depth, but in embassy, if you're in embassy, you can.
So to get your citizenship, you have to actually go to Liberia. You can't get it from here. So the embassies are not going to give you citizenship. You do have to go to Liberia. There is a process you go through immigration, and they're going to make you put your hand up and swear loyalty to Liberia, and that's it. But yeah, you can't go to the embassy to get citizenship.
That clarifies it for us. Baruti, that clarifies your answer. And of course, she said, Les, please bring her back on. Yes, so thank you so much, Mrs. Fombole. This was just a really great
thanks for having me.
Anytime. We're going to definitely keep in contact. Make sure you guys like, share, and subscribe. Make sure you comment down below. Tell us what you think of this interview. Of course, sign up to the website at blafricstan.org/register. The more members we have, the more we can get in the nation process. And remember, we have our Liberia trip coming up this May in 2022. So we're going to be there this May. So
exciting.
Yeah, so that's what we have going on. And so we want as many of you guys to be citizens, and many of us to be citizens, and of course, many of us be a part of the BIO because that is our mission. So once again, thank you so much, Mrs. Fombole, and you guys have a great rest of the day. And we have a topic on the lounge today at the book club at 7 p.m. and at 8 p.m. we have our regular lounge discussions. So as I do, I'm Jabari, and this is Mrs. Fombole. It was a great time speaking with you.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.